Welcome to the MIPAR tutorial for running a 2D batch. So this tutorial assumes that you have seen most, if not all, of the image processor tutorials, which involve creating a recipe to batch process. So what I'm going to do is start by just opening up the image processor and reminding us of what recipe we created. So let's open up the image that we've been working with and load in that same recipe. Now I'm going to load in the one that we made with layers and measurements. And you'll see that once the recipe gets done, we now have not only the loaded recipe, the end result, and the layers that we made, but we've also got the area fraction performed on the two layers and the results reported to us here in this dialog window. So just a way of automating everything that was saved into the recipe. Okay, so our two layers are the tertiary smaller particles and the secondary smaller particles, and we will have these steps in the recipe saved for each image that the recipe is run on, in addition to these measurements measured from each layer in two separate spreadsheets. So just an overview of what recipe is going to be batch processed and what the outcomes are going to be. Okay, so we can, if we'd like, launch the batch processor directly from the image processor. If we launch it from the launch bar here, we get the batch processor, excuse me. But if we launch it from the image processor with a recipe that's been loaded in, then that recipe is brought in automatically for us. So that's it. Let's show that again. Just from the image processor, launch batch processor, in comes the recipe. If we opened up the batch processor fresh, then we would just hit load and we would pick that file and hit open. So there's the recipe to be batch applied. We have grayscale images. That's been selected by default. Let's choose where to save the output of this batch processing. We can just stick everything in this same folder. You'll see you'll actually get a separate processed folder for the processed images. That's the folder. We can choose to append or not append a suffix to the file names that get processed. The underscore processed suffix is the default, but you can set that to something else if you'd like. You will have the separate layers underscored with the name of the layer in addition to the suffix. So underscore processed as a generic suffix is usually okay. You can set it to something else if you'd like. And let's pick the images to be added. We just have 5 images here today. So click one, shift, click the rest. We can move them around if we'd like to reorder them. But I think the way they came in by default is okay. Sort file names is automatically checked. Unchecking this will not resort the current file names. This applies to what you select after you hit add images. So if I unsorted file names and then hit add images and picked a new set, just pick the same ones for example, those would get added to the bottom of the previous set in an unsorted fashion, or at least in the it would only use the sorting that the operating system chose them with. It wouldn't apply its own sorting algorithm. So again, those got appended to the end of the list. So that's how you could say select files to be processed from different folders. Let's remove back those images, so we only have these 5 images to process. If you double-click on any file in the list, you will see that image. It's just a way to check and make sure that you're processing the images that you intend to. So I think we're set up. We've loaded the recipe, we've used the default image type, told MIPAR where to save the output, set up the images to be processed. We don't need a calibration factor. I did forget to save the recipe after one of the previous tutorials when we set up a calibration factor. Remember that any calibration factor that's present when you save the recipe gets saved into the recipe file. So if I had saved the recipe after calibrating, there would be a calibration factor here. But because we're only measuring area fraction, we don't need a calibration factor. If we were measuring something that usually would need a calibration factor, like length, and we didn't have one, the length would be reported in pixels, and if we do have one, it would be reported in microns. So I don't need any of these options here. These 3 are typically used for 3D reconstruction, as are these other 2 boxes. So I think we're set up to run a batch. So let me just click process and we will start the batch. So down here we see the current process that the batch processor is on. We'll see this highlight move from one image to the next as we process through the different images. You see that number indicated down here, the percentage complete, and an estimate of the time remaining that will update when a new image begins processing. So we'll just go ahead and let the batch complete. Okay, and we finished. In terms of output, if we take a look at our folder where we've instructed MIPAR to output all of the processed results, in our processed folder we have for each image a secondary and tertiary processed output, since we had 2 layers, one named secondary, one named tertiary. Windows does some strange things with the display of binary images sometimes, so these black lines are not actually there, but I still wanted to show you just in Windows Explorer what the output was. So secondary, tertiary, secondary, tertiary. And it doesn't look too bad. So we'll take a look at these in a much more helpful way in the next tutorial on the on the processed image editor. But I also want to just quickly show the measurements that were output. So we got 2 measurements folders, one for each layer, and inside of measurements secondary, if we open that in Excel, you see for the 5 images we have the area fraction, and again this is for the secondary layer. And then if we look at the tertiary measurements, we have the area fraction for the tertiary layer. So that is a batch process, and again, if you'd like to see a more thorough review and perhaps some edits of the batch process, then please tune in for the next tutorial or set of tutorials on the processed image editor. Thanks again for tuning in, and I hope to see you next time.